The real economic flashpoint in California's trucking sector isn't truckers spontaneously abandoning the roads. It's a federal showdown over commercial driver's licenses, CDLs, that's now bleeding into the state budget and signaling deeper structural tension. What's in view isn't an industry collapse in the classic sense, like mass bankruptcies or freight drying up, but a clash between federal regulatory power, state policy choices, and labor market realities that carries real economic costs and political fallout. At the center of this dispute is the U.S. Department of Transportation, U.S. DOT, led by Transportation Secretary Sean Duffy, which has found that a significant number of CDLs issued by California to non-U.S. citizens, including immigrants with work authorization, did not meet federal eligibility requirements. In response, the department has withheld about $160 million in federal transportation funding, adding to previous withholdings totaling hundreds of millions after California missed a federally set deadline to revoke roughly 17,000 of these licenses. This isn't a small administrative dispute. Federal highway funds are a major revenue stream for state transportation projects, road safety programs, and enforcement related to freight movement. Withholding such funds effectively tightens the state's fiscal room, especially as governors budget for infrastructure, maintenance, and public safety support tied to commercial transit. That pressure cascades into other areas of the economy, from port operations to road hauling capacity, because freight depends on reliable regulatory frameworks and stable funding flows. What's really at stake isn't so much whether trucks are currently running, they are, but whether policy uncertainty and federal penalties are undermining confidence within the trucking sector and the broader logistics network. Trucking associations publicly backed federal enforcement of license standards, signaling private sector support for stricter compliance even as California pushes back. At the same time, immigrant labor is embedded in California's freight ecosystem. Estimates suggest that immigrants comprise a sizable portion of the state's truck drivers, and proposed federal regulations could affect tens of thousands more licenses. If large numbers of drivers were forced out of work due to licensing disputes, whether through enforcement actions or ripple effects, the supply of drivers could tighten, pushing up shipping costs and labor scarcity pressure. Economists warn such disruptions would raise operational costs for carriers and could slow goods movement through critical hubs like the ports of Los Angeles and Oakland. Governor Gavin Newsom and California officials have argued that the state is complying with federal law and that some delays in revocations were due to administrative and legal complexities. Civil rights groups and immigrant advocacy organizations have also sued over the revocations, framing parts of the federal push as discriminatory. That litigation reflects deeper socio-political cleavages. The cost of enforcement isn't just economic, but also political, straining relationships between state leadership, immigrant communities, and federal authorities. This situation feeds into a much larger narrative about California's fiscal health. The state faces persistent budget challenges, with repeated shortfalls forcing hard choices about spending priorities. With federal funds now in flux, Newsom's budget calculus becomes tighter, and critics from both political parties weaponize the dispute for broader critiques on fiscal management, regulatory competence, and economic stewardship. So the collapse story fits better as a political narrative than an economic fact. But that doesn't make the underlying strain insignificant. The mechanism at work now is funding pressure, plus regulatory conflict, plus labor uncertainty, and those forces can meaningfully impact freight costs, public investment, and California's already precarious economic balance. From here, the next part will break down how this conflict actually affects day-to-day trucking economics, the the players who benefit or lose, and why the licensing issue became a flashpoint in the first place. To understand why this licensing fight matters economically, you have to drop the moral language and look at cost structures. Trucking is a low-margin business. Most carriers operate on margins in the low single digits. Small owner-operators, which dominate California's intrastate freight, live even closer to the edge. That means any regulatory shock, even one that doesn't collapse the industry, redistributes pain fast and unevenly. Start with labor. California already has one of the tightest trucking labor markets in the country. High housing costs, long port wait times, strict emissions rules, and congestion all push drivers away or demand higher pay to compensate. Immigrant drivers, including those with temporary work authorization, fill a structural gap, not because anyone is being generous, but because the job needs to be done at wages the market can still bear. Now insert a federal rule enforcement that threatens tens of thousands of licenses. Even if only a fraction are ultimately revoked, the expectation of enforcement matters. Carriers don't plan based on best-case scenarios. They plan defensively. That means fewer new contracts, higher freight rates quoted to hedge risk, and more pressure pushed downstream to shippers, warehouses, retailers, agricultural exporters, who then push it to consumers. This is how inflationary pressure works in the real economy, not through abstract price shocks, but through uncertainty premiums layered onto every transaction. Who benefits from this? Large national carriers are insulated. They already comply with federal standards across multiple states. They have compliance departments, legal teams, and diversified driver pools. When smaller California-based operators struggle, market share quietly shifts upward. This is a classic consolidation mechanism. Regulation doesn't kill the industry. It reshapes ownership. Who loses? Small trucking firms, independent drivers, and regional logistics companies that depend on flexibility. Many of these operators already absorbed heavy costs from California's emissions mandates, especially the requirement to upgrade or replace diesel fleets. Add licensing risk on top, and some exit the market not in a dramatic collapse, but through attrition. One truck sold, one contract dropped, one driver leaving the state. Now zoom out to the state budget. The federal government withholding transportation funds doesn't directly shut down trucking, but it forces trade-offs. Deferred road maintenance increases vehicle wear. Slower infrastructure projects raise congestion. Congestion raises fuel use, labor hours, and delivery delays. Again, not a collapse, a cost spiral. This is where political narratives start distorting reality. Critics claim California's policies are destroying trucking. Defenders say the industry is doing fine. Both miss the mechanism. The issue isn't survival versus collapse. It's who absorbs the cost and who escapes it. California's leadership has incentives here too. The state depends heavily on freight movement, ports, agriculture, retail distribution, but it also depends politically on immigrant labor constituencies and environmental regulation coalitions. Federal enforcement puts the governor in a bind. Comply quickly and anger key political allies, or resist and risk funding penalties that weaken already strained budgets. That's why the state's response has been slow, legalistic, and procedural. Delay isn't incompetence, it's strategy. Every month of delay keeps drivers working, freight moving, and political backlash muted. But delay also invites federal retaliation, which shows up as funding pressure rather than headline-grabbing enforcement raids. This is how modern economic conflict plays out, not with sudden crashes, but with administrative strangulation, paperwork, deadlines, grants frozen, appeals pending. And here's the key point most commentary ignores. Trucking doesn't need to collapse to hurt the economy. It just needs to become more expensive, more consolidated, and less flexible. That's enough to raise prices, weaken small businesses, and increase dependence on large national logistics firms. In the next part, we'll look at how this fight ties into California's broader regulatory model, emissions rules, labor classification laws, and why trucking keeps becoming the pressure point where these policies collide with economic reality. Trucking keeps becoming the pressure point in California because it sits at the intersection of three policy regimes that all raise costs independently, but interact multiplicatively: environmental regulation, labor classification, and infrastructure control. Each one is defensible on its own terms. Together, they form a squeeze that reshapes the industry without ever announcing that's what they're doing. Start with emissions. California has some of the most aggressive clean air rules in the country, especially for heavy-duty trucks. The state has pushed fleet operators toward newer diesel standards and, increasingly, toward zero-emission vehicles. The stated goal is public health and climate mitigation. The economic effect is straightforward. Capital costs rise sharply. A new compliant truck can cost hundreds of thousands of dollars more than an older model. Electric or hydrogen options are even more expensive and, critically, rely on charging or fueling infrastructure that is still incomplete. Large carriers can finance these upgrades. Small operators can't, at least not easily. So what happens? They lease, they sell, or they exit. Again, not a collapse, a filtering process. Now add labor law. California's worker classification regime, especially the rules that restrict independent contracting, hits trucking particularly hard. The traditional owner-operator model depends on drivers owning their rigs and contracting flexibly with carriers. Reclassify those drivers as employees, and suddenly the cost structure flips: payroll taxes, benefits, compliance overhead. For some firms, it makes economic sense to vertically integrate. For others, it doesn't pencil out at all. The result is fewer independent drivers and more centralized control, either through big carriers or through logistics platforms that can absorb compliance costs at scale. That's not an accident. It's how regulatory systems tend to reward organizational size. Then there's infrastructure. California controls some of the most important freight arteries in the country: major ports, highways, and rail interfaces. When federal transportation funds are withheld or delayed, the effects don't show up immediately. Roads don't vanish, ports don't close. What happens instead is deferred maintenance, slower upgrades, and bottlenecks that quietly eat productivity. Time is money in trucking. An hour lost at a port isn't an inconvenience. It's unpaid labor, wasted fuel, missed delivery windows, and penalties. When infrastructure degrades or congestion increases, the cost lands on drivers and small carriers first. Large firms renegotiate contracts or pass costs through. Small ones absorb them until they can't. Put all this together, and you get a consistent pattern. California's model doesn't blow industries up. It selects. It selects for firms that are capital heavy, legally sophisticated, and politically connected. It selects against those that rely on thin margins, informal flexibility, or individual ownership. This is why the trucking collapse narrative is misleading. What's actually happening is a recomposition of power inside the industry. Ownership concentrates, risk shifts downward, compliance becomes a competitive advantage rather than a cost shared equally. From the governor's perspective, this is a balancing act. Environmental groups, labor advocates, and urban voters support these policies. Freight-dependent regions, small business owners, and rural drivers bear the costs. The state's economic statistics can still look fine while specific sectors hollow out underneath. And here's the political economy irony. When trucking becomes more consolidated and expensive, the same policymakers who supported the regulations face pressure over inflation, supply chain resilience, and cost of living. The system generates its own backlash, but only after the structural shift is complete. In the next part, we'll look at how this plays nationally, why federal authorities are willing to squeeze California now, and how this fight fits into a broader struggle over who sets the rules of the U.S. logistics economy. What's happening between California and the federal government isn't just a regulatory spat. It's a jurisdictional power struggle over who gets to set the operating rules for the national logistics system. Trucking crosses state lines by definition. That makes it one of the few industries where federal authority is not optional, and Washington knows it. From the federal perspective, California is a problem because it's big enough to export its rules. When California tightens emissions standards, manufacturers adapt nationwide. When it reshapes labor classification, logistics firms reorganize their national operations to avoid fragmentation. That gives the state outsized influence, and federal agencies have long tolerated it because California also moves a huge share of U.S. trade. But tolerance has limits. Licensing is one of the few levers where federal authority is clear, direct, and enforceable. Commercial driver standards are federally defined precisely because inconsistent rules would break interstate commerce. By enforcing CDL compliance and tying it to funding, the federal government is signaling something important. This is where uniformity matters more than state experimentation. Follow the incentives. Federal officials aren't trying to shut down California's trucking sector. They're asserting control. Withholding funds is cheaper and cleaner than mass enforcement. It avoids direct confrontation with drivers while still disciplining state policy. It also plays well politically. We're enforcing the rules. The state chose non-compliance. For California's governor, the bind tightens. If the state fully complies, thousands of drivers could lose the ability to work, triggering economic disruption and political backlash in immigrant communities and freight-heavy regions. If the state resists, funding losses accumulate and infrastructure suffers. Either way, the cost is real, but the timing and visibility differ. This is why both sides lean on legal process, appeals, extensions, compliance plans, phased revocations. Law becomes a delaying tactic and a shield. Every month bought through procedure keeps trucks moving and spreads the pain thinly enough to avoid a headline crisis. Zoom out further and you see the national stakes. The U.S. logistics system is still fragile after years of pandemic disruption, port congestion, and global shocks. Federal authorities want predictability. California's layered regulatory model introduces variability, higher costs, slower adaptation, and legal uncertainty. From Washington's point of view, that's tolerable until it threatens system-wide reliability. There's also politics in the narrow sense. California's governor is a national figure. Confrontation with federal authority feeds broader narratives about governance, immigration, and economic management. Neither side needs to say this out loud for it to shape strategy. What's missing from most coverage is the structural reality. Truckers are the transmission belt. They don't make the rules. They absorb them. When governments fight, the fight shows up as longer hours, higher debt, and thinner margins for people behind the wheel. And this is why the word collapse keeps surfacing. Not because the industry suddenly stops functioning, but because for individuals inside it, the experience feels like collapse. Stability erodes. Planning becomes impossible. Exit starts to look rational. In the final part, we'll pull this together. What this episode tells us about California's economic model, the future of trucking, and why these conflicts keep recurring in sectors that are essential but politically weak. Step back, and the pattern becomes hard to ignore. California isn't mismanaging trucking in isolation. Trucking is just one of the stress points where the state's broader economic model collides with material reality. The model relies on aggressive regulation, moral framing, and the assumption that essential work will continue to get done no matter how many costs are layered on top. Most of the time, that assumption holds until it doesn't. Trucking exposes the limits because it's essential, mobile, and politically weak. You can't offshore it. You can't automate it away at scale. And the people doing the work don't have strong lobbying power compared to tech firms, real estate interests, or finance. That makes trucking a convenient place for costs to land without immediate backlash. This episode tells us something uncomfortable. Economic systems don't break where the rhetoric is loudest. They break where the margins are thinnest. California can post strong GDP numbers, dominate venture capital flows, and still quietly hollow out sectors that move food, goods, and materials. The governor can defend policies as successful in aggregate while entire occupational groups experience steady degradation. For trucking, the likely future is not collapse but transformation through concentration, fewer independent operators, more large carriers, more vertically integrated logistics chains tied to big retailers and platforms. That may look efficient on paper, but it carries costs, less resilience, less local capacity, and less bargaining power for workers. When shocks hit, fuel spikes, port disruptions, labor shortages, a concentrated system bends less easily. For the state, the lesson is sharper. Federal authority sets hard boundaries. California can innovate inside them, but when it pushes too far in sectors tied to interstate commerce, Washington will push back, not loudly, but financially. Grants frozen, deadlines enforced, compliance demanded. This is how federalism actually works in practice, not in civics textbooks. Politically, the governor's risk isn't a sudden trucking meltdown. It's a slow accumulation of grievances. Higher prices blamed on corporate greed, supply problems framed as bad luck, and workers quietly exiting industries that no longer make sense. By the time those effects show up in elections or fiscal crises, the causal chain is hard to trace, which is precisely why the system persists. So when you hear the trucking industry is collapsing, translate it. What's really collapsing is the viability of small-scale participation in a heavily regulated economy. What's expanding is scale, compliance, and concentration. That's not unique to trucking. It's happening across healthcare, housing, agriculture, and energy. The real question isn't whether California's model is good or bad in the abstract. It's this: who is expected to absorb the costs when policies collide? And how long can essential workers do that before they walk away? That's where the economic fallout really lives.